Welcome to our episode of Biblical Archaeology, From the Ground Down. Presented by Bible Interact and hosted by Dr. George Sparks. Join us as we explore the fascinating world of the Bible from leading experts in the field of archaeology.
Hello, my name is Dr. George Sparks, and this is Biblical Archaeology from the Ground Down. We have a special guest today. It's Dr. David Graves, PhD. I'm very excited to have him. He is the guest speaker. We're also going to be he's going to be talking about his book called Digging Up the Bible. And it's very interesting. I went over it last week and read it myself.
Welcome to my exploration of Mount Ararat and the search for Noah's Ark. In 2006, I traveled to Turkey with our President Rex Geisler from Archaeology and explored the Ahura Gorge for any evidence of Noah's Ark. It culminated in a successful partnership with Ataturk University in Turkey. As I stepped out of the plane and onto the Turkish soil, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and anticipation. After months of planning and negotiations, our Ark imaging team had finally secured a partnership with Ataturk University for research on and around Agri Dagi, also known as Mount Ararat. Despite the past month's rain, we were greeted with clear blue skies for the entire trip. We are grateful for their trust and belief in our mission, and we are excited to continue our journey to uncover the secrets of Mount Ararat. Many believe from the weight of evidence that the Ark is above or in the Ahura Gorge on the northeast side of Mount Ararat. In 2006, our team explored the Ahura Gorge and did a surface survey of the region. No evidence of Noah's Ark was located. While the story of Noah's Ark continues to captivate and fascinate people, it is important to rely on scientific evidence and facts rather than one's imagination. But just because no evidence was yet found at the site does not mean the biblical events did not happen. No evidence of the ancient Ark of Noah was identified on Mount Ararat, although more research will be conducted in the future. This and many other discoveries with academic references can be found in our books listed on our website smyrnian.blogspot.com and available on amazon.com.
Okay, thank you. Welcome back. Once again, our topic today is David Graves' book, Digging Up the Bible. And a little bit more about Dr. Graves. He has received his PhD from the University of Aberdeen. He has also taught the Bible and archaeology for over 35 years. He has taught at Oxford University, England, as well as Liberty University School of Divinity. He has given tours through the Ashmolean British Museum. He has traveled extensively through the Middle East, has been at excavations such as Qumran, the Temple Mount, and Shiloh in Israel. That's on the Israel side, and on the Jordan side, Tel El Hammam, where Dr. Graves was my square supervisor many years ago. So no further ado, once again, Dr. David Graves. Welcome to the program, sir.
Hi, George. Good to be with you.
Yeah, at this time, we're going to start on your book, Digging Up the Bible. Let me ask you one question. What encouraged you to write this book to begin with?
Well, I began teaching a course at Oxford University called the History of British Biblical Archaeology. We had students from Canada and from the Netherlands, and we were able to teach it at Regent Park College. And so it came out of, part of it came out of that. And of course, I did probably 20 years of excavating in the Middle East and Israel and Jordan and Turkey and traveling throughout Egypt. So all of that material came together in that book. So I have a part of it that I deal with a brief history of archaeology, and then I do a section on how we do archaeology, which I think we'll be talking about on another podcast.
Yes. Okay, so at the beginning of your book, you talked about, and I don't want to get ahead of you. If you want to direct us another avenue than what my notes go, feel free to. This is your time, and it's your book. The fallacies of neutrality. Do you have any information on that? Do you want to hit on that at all?
Well, everybody has a belief or a presupposition that they bring to the text, and probably one of the most common fallacies is the fallacy of neutrality, that everybody's neutral and they have no opinion. And that's just not the case. We all bring something to our view. If we say there is no opinion, then you still have an opinion of no opinion.
I
So
see where you're going with that. So
I
we could
just,
say that we ought, depending on our backgrounds, we also have a type of biblical bias. Is that fair to say?
true, that's right. And I just want scholars to be honest with their bias
Mhm.
and bring to bear, let the audience know what their bias is. My bias is, of course, I believe the Bible is historically true and accurate, can be trusted when we read the text, that it's reliable, and so that's my bias. And so I interpret everything through that lens. If
Right.
someone doesn't believe that and they think that the biblical account is a myth, that's still a bias, and they bring that lens to how they interpret and they look at all the information, all the data. So I just say, be honest with your bias, and be honest with it, and make your defense.
Okay. So like you said, later on in your book, you did mention what we use a terminology for this in archaeology is if you believe, such as what you said, your bias is the entire Bible is factual, that's called a maximalist. If another individual in their study says that they think it's mostly a myth, that's what we call the minimalist. But they also have the scholars that waver somewhere back and forth depending on what we're talking about and where the archaeology is at. So that's somebody kind of like in the middle.
I call them minimalists.
Minimalist. That's a good
And the way
term.
I explain it to my students to make it easier for them, the minimalist are the minimal amount of history, the maximalists are the maximal amount of history.
Okay. Next in your book, you mentioned this is just to I once again, we did drop your intro. I encourage everybody because I got the whole series of your books. And I think every church, you're doing yourself a favor by getting these books. Because if you're going to invite guest speakers on archaeology and you want some information to make sure what they're telling you is not just sensational, but legit and factual, this is a good resource. And he gives a lot of good names of scholars to also reach out to. And even I can encourage you to reach out to Dr. Graves himself. Is that fair?
Yes, anybody that's looking to have a question answered, I can do my best to do that for them, and they can send me an email, contact me. I don't know, you'll probably have it in your podcast somewhere.
Absolutely. Next quick subject in your book is the competition of the Rosetta Stone that brought to light the hieroglyphs for the first time, what, in about 2,000 years, maybe?
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that competition, if that's okay.
Well, archaeology is a fairly new science, art. Some call it an art. The antiquarians started it in the early, probably 17th century, and they were beginning to do the hunting and the looting and trying to find some artifacts and grave robbers. The first archaeological dig probably was at Herculaneum or Pompeii, and they were run by a Spanish archaeologist and an Italian. So that's where the science of archaeology first really began. And then we have, of course, the introduction of the British Museum. So the Society of Antiquities in 1751 were promoting the artifacts through their journal. A private collection of a gentleman by the name of Sir Hans Sloane took his collection and put it in his house. And then when he died, he bequeathed that to the society, and they turned this into the British Museum. So the birth of the British Museum was actually his home, his house. And it was filled with all kinds of artifacts. They even had a life-size stuffed giraffe in the hallway down the stairs in the museum. Well, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone was done by a gentleman by the name of Boussard. He was one of the soldiers in Napoleon's army in 1799. And the hieroglyphs on the stone had never been identified. They could translate them. They didn't know it was an unknown language. So if you can think about it, that all of the hieroglyphs that we now read in Egypt were unknown before that time. And the Rosetta Stone became an important artifact because it was 2 languages, 3 inscriptions. So you had the Egyptian hieroglyphs. In the middle, you had it's called Egyptian Demotic. This is like shorthand for Egyptian. And then you had Greek. Well, they understood what the Greeks said. And so from that, they were able to go back and translate what the Egyptian hieroglyphs were saying. It took a process over a number of years. When the French surrendered to Egypt to the British, the British took the Rosetta Stone as a gift from the French, and that's how it ended up in the British Museum. But what's interesting as well is that the Louvre in France was out trying to find artifacts as well, but they ended up able to get into the Louvre free, and you had to pay to get into the British Museum. Today, that has been switched. It's free to get into the British Museum, and now you have to pay to get into the Louvre. So there's a rush to collect artifacts at this time period in history, and so the British and the French are sending out all of their archaeologists to the Middle East trying to find things. And thus begins the quest for artifacts in this period of history. And that's why the Rosetta Stone is so important, because it has unlocked the mystery of the Egyptian hieroglyphs and just has opened the door to so much history that we have in the ancient Near East. The 2 men that identified were 2 men by the name of Thomas Young. He was a linguist, and he understood what the cartouches were, these round circles. They were the name of the pharaohs. And then Jean-Francois Champollion did further work on it. I tell the whole story, I think, in my book, or part of it at least, of how they did that. It was quite an involved process, but it became an important discovery, and has sort of been in one of the linchpins of in the British Museum because of its importance in understanding Egyptian hieroglyphics.
Okay, so this is almost like a competition between the British and the French. Who won? Who won the battle of translating? Who actually say we translated it first? Because, like you said, I think it was the battle. It was called the Battle of the Pyramids, and I think the French lost, and the British acquired the Rosetta Stone. But you know something? I was reading a little bit about that, and then I'll zip it. It was actually fought in a melon patch. But the Battle of Melons doesn't sound near as intriguing as the Battle of the Pyramids, so it's been known as the Battle of the Pyramids. But who won the race in deciphering the hieroglyphs, the French or the British?
Oh, good question. It goes back and forth. They each have a contribution that they made, identifying that, first of all, they thought it was a direct translation, but then the British discovered that it was just a paraphrase. And so Champollion was probably the one of the French who assisted in his work when he had about 2,000 pages of inscriptions that he worked from, working from his meager alphabet and skillfully applying the knowledge of his Coptic and of the Rosetta Stone. He successfully deciphered them. So it was Champollion, the Frenchman, who actually eventually cracked the code and was able to decipher it. They found that it was a paraphrase, so it wasn't a literal word for word. So like we have paraphrase Bibles that are literal word for word. The same thing happened with this bilingual tablet that we have with the Rosetta Stone.
Okay, so there's a competition. Now, you said the French are going out to acquire things for their museum, the Louvre, and the British are going out to acquire for their museum, which becomes the British Museum. Are they sending out trained archaeologists, or are these explorers and adventurers? Who are these people?
Most of them are actually diplomats. And so they are diplomats that they send out initially to Iraq. And so we have Sir Henry Layard. Some of them are explorers. In the case of Belzoni, who married an English lady, he's a barber, but some of these people have great abilities to do translation, and they're linguists.
You said Belzoni was a barber, like
cutting hair. Yes, originally.
Yeah, let's say that I don't have to worry about that. But anyway, but okay, I didn't know that.
And Belzoni was also, he traveled at a circus in England. That's how he made a living, as a strongman.
That's right. Yeah.
And so he ended up, he was great with his magic that he was doing, and his magic lanterns, and his wife was involved with his show, and he traveled throughout England and then traveled into Europe. And it was through those travels that he ended up being assigned by Henry Salt. He was the first actually to enter the Giza pyramid.
Wow.
And he found the tomb of Seti the First in the Valley of the Kings.
Which would be Ramses' father?
Perhaps. I'm not an Egyptologist, so
okay, all right.
But
so who else was like an adventure explorer that has this unique background? These, they come and they're exploring, but they got a variety of different backgrounds. Can you give us insight to that?
Sure, yes. Well, another one is Sir Henry Layard, Austin Henry Layard. He was sent as a diplomat to the Middle East. And on his days off, he would go out, and he came to the Tigris by accident. And then he discovered the mounds of Nimrod and Nineveh. And Nimrod is Kala in our Bibles, Genesis 10. So by 1845, he's digging the mounds of Nimrod, and he finds all kinds of very significant artifacts that take the heart, really, of the British Museum these days, especially the Assyrian reliefs. The Palace of Sennacherib he discovered, the Library of Ashurbanipal with thousands of tablets, a huge mound. And he began to dig it, and he found all of these amazing artifacts, such as the black obelisk that has the picture of the earliest known king of Israel. He discovered the large pair of winged statues called Lazaru, and they were taken apart. He cut them in half, and he carted them off by boat 2,600 miles over 2 oceans to bring them back to the British Museum. He trenched down 90 feet in the ground, 16 feet wide and 22 feet deep, to get this thing. And so all of these artifacts are now brought back to the British Museum. The black obelisk stands about 6 feet high, and you can see on the side of it, King Jehu, it reads, son of Omri, yes. I received from him silver and gold and a golden bowl, and he's bowing down, giving tribute to Shalmaneser.
That's a heck of a way to be remembered.
Yeah. So he's actually etched in stone.
Yeah, that's it. So in other words, what we do is have it's not that archaeology is set out to do this, but in this case, we do have some validation to the biblical narrative, maybe outside the biblical narrative even, because we're talking about Jehu. So we're going back to the time of Ahab and Jezebel and those events in the Bible that are quite interesting.
Yes. And one of the other discoveries in the tablets that he discovered was the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Wow, that's right.
One of the first both creation and flood epics. We have also the Epic of creation, the Enuma Elish. I was able to take my students to the British Museum and go into the back, knocked on this big double door, and they let us in. And I was able to find it in the British Museum. They were able to collect it and bring it out, and I could show it to the students. It wasn't on display of the Epic of creation. So we have these artifacts that are held now in the British Museum. There are thousands. There's like 30,000 different tablets they have now, and they're still translating them.
Wow. 30,000. So let me get this right. You went to the British Museum with your students and you got access to the Enuma Elish?
The Enuma Elish, yes, the creation
Wow.
epic.
That. What does that go back to? Was that like 3,000 years BC? What is that? Do you remember?
I'd have to look up the exact dates on that. My memory is going on me now. So,
Okay, I
um,
didn't mean to.
but
I'm just
it's
thinking it's
very
very,
early.
very early.
It's
Yeah.
one of the very early tablets that describes the creation from the ancient Near Eastern perspective. The debate now, of course, is which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yes.
Did the
Yes.
Epic of Gilgamesh come first, or did the biblical account come first? I think what we can say, in my view, is that they both trace back to a very early true story, and they just describe it in terms of their two different cultures.
Who else is out there that's got a colorful background that you'd like to bring up?
Well, as we move forward, there's a large number of them. I'm writing a new book actually on the history of biblical archaeology that's going to look at them in depth. I did a brief overview in the book that you were talking about. I think probably another colorful individual is and one that people may not be familiar with is T.E. Lawrence of Arabia.
Yes.
He was a British officer who studied under Sir Leonard Woolley, who was working in at Ur. This is where we believe Abraham came from, although there are two different locations for Ur. Whether this is the one that's connected with the Bible and Abraham or not, we're not certain of. But Lawrence ended up working on a map. Originally, he did his master's degree on medieval castles. He traveled all over the Middle East and documented them. And he got the highest mark that a person can get at Oxford on this topic, and it's still being used and referenced today. But he worked on a map mapping the Sinai Peninsula. He's the one that did that. It was actually used during the Second or the First World War. He was a British advisor to Prince Faisal during the Arab Revolt and Turkish rule. And he went to the Middle East as an archaeologist, but in actual fact, what he was a spy for the British under the cover of an archaeologist. And so but he was a competent Middle Eastern archaeologist. He focused on the Crusaders and the Hittites. He located Abel Shatim, or not Abel Shatim, sorry. What's the name of it? It'll come to me in a minute.
Right,
but one of the sites, and so he was working also with the British Museum and the Ashmolean Museum, encouraged him to pursue his interests. And so he went on and did all of this research on the Middle East. Woolley would later discover Ur, of course, of the Chaldees, and it was Lawrence of Arabia who copied inscriptions and photographed the finds, cataloged the discoveries, and bought antiquities and used his mechanical ingenuity to solve problems. All of that, all under the cover of being a spy for the British. So that's
amazing.
They've made a movie out of it.
Yeah, years ago there was that movie, Lawrence of Arabia, about like early 1960s.
Yes.
Yes.
And that one doesn't deal so much with his archaeology, but there's another movie done by the BBC that focuses on his archaeology, which is quite interesting. And he did also a survey of the wilderness of Zen, detailed mapping and photography of the area for the British, all under the guise of working with Sir Leonard Woolley. Kadesh Barnea, that was the word I was trying to remember, the site. He discovered the biblical site, and identified it. And it is still being recognized even today as one of the biblical sites that he has identified. So he was an important individual, and also working with Sir Leonard Woolley at the time was another lady of some interest in character, Agatha Christie. Now, we know her as the famous mystery writer, but in 1926, she disappeared, Um, she was suspected of being murdered by her husband, who wouldn't give her a divorce that he demanded in 1928. And so she staged this apparent murder. After a while, he finally reneged and gave her her divorce. And then she went on the Orient Express and traveled to the ancient Near East and stopped where Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating at Ur. And she returned in 1930, and she met the assistant dig director by the name of Max Mallowan. And he proposed to her, and he married her. And she stayed on working with Sir Leonard Woolley and Lawrence of Arabia and her husband Max Mallowan at Ur, and became a distinguished archaeologist in her own right. She was a junior assistant. She did the cleaning of the. In fact, the story goes that the ivories that she discovered, she cleaned them with her makeup, the material that she had in her kit for her makeup. She used that to do the cleaning of the ivories. She repaired objects. She matched pottery fragments, and she taught herself photography and was one of the first archaeologists to do the 2D photography. And many of the photographs that you see of Sir Leonard Woolley's site were done by her. She created a closet where she did her developing in and went back to England and learned how to do photography, cataloging the finds. And of course, we have archaeology that inspired her to write the Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile, Murder in Mesopotamia. So these books came right out of her personal firsthand experience doing the dig at Ur.
Would you want to talk about Sir Flinders Petrie?
Well, Petrie was an interesting character. He worked primarily in Egypt originally, and he worked there for a number of years, excavating a site that doesn't really relate to the Bible. But what happened was he discovered that the pottery that he was working on there was very similar to the pottery that he found when he did his survey in Palestine. And doing the comparison of the two from Tallahassee in Egypt, or in Palestine, to the sites in the Negev that he was looking at in Egypt, he discovered that there was a similarity between the pottery. It's interesting that at 8 years of age, he says the earth ought to be parsed away inch by inch to see all that is in it and how it lies. Can you imagine 8 years old and understood this idea of how we should strip away the earth like a layer cake and do stratigraphy? So He became famous for his methodology and the procedures on doing stratigraphy.
He also brought archaeology, wouldn't you say, from being just a treasure hunt to actually the earliest form of science. He said stratigraphy, that's the layers, but within the stratigraphy, we have pottery. And throughout the layers, if we can think of layers being like a laundry basket, where the oldest, like Monday's laundry, is on the bottom and Friday's laundry is at the top. So as we go down, it gets older and older. And he noticed that just as in every culture, style changes, technique changes, technology also. So he made a uniform chart of pottery, which was called, I believe, time sequence dating.
Yes, or sequential dating.
Okay.
And so he combined the different strata, the different layers, with the correlation of the pottery types at one site with similar and intervening types elsewhere on other sites. And through that process, he was able to do accurate dating and comparative dating sequentially between two different sites. And that's how we were able to link together the pottery and the dating of Egypt with the pottery and the dating from Palestine at the time.
Right.
And he was a interesting character.
Right.
lived out in caves. He was a bit of had some racist ideas. He was a radical theorist of eugenics. Referred to refused to accept the contributions of others to pottery typology and misdating strata by up to 1,000 years. So he was quite a controversial individual as well. And also another individual, an Irish guy by the name of McAllister, who had he was an Irish archaeologist, some East-West racial conflict that he had in his background. Petrie was, he lived into his 80s and he was still directing fieldwork in his 80s. And he could, some say that he could walk faster than they could at that age. And he died in Jerusalem, was buried on Mount Zion, and his head was taken to London.
He's a very, I could say a bit eccentric.
Colorful.
He also was one of the first ones, I think, to measure or excavate around the pyramids. I'm not quite how the story goes, but he did some of his work in a ballerina's tutu.
Yeah.
And I guess so that in the Near Eastern culture, there was exclusivities to those that were thought to be a little crazy. And as long as they were crazy but didn't hurt anybody, you left them alone. So he used that in his, to get his work done and to not be interfered with. Now and then at the very end, he leaves his brain to posterity. It was actually in a bottle of formaldehyde, lost for years and years in the British Museum. And here recently, they refound it. And it's still in a good state of preservation if you're worried about Petrie's head,
Yes.
But matter of fact, when I was in Israel many years ago, I went to I think it's the Protestant cemetery in Zion. Mm-hmm. And when I was there, a guide took me over to see his gravesite. Wow. Very humble, a very humble gravesite. You wouldn't know unless somebody pointed it out. Yeah. At this time, we're going to finish our first session. We're going to go on to the second one, part 2. Thank you for being with us. And Dr. Graves will continue in part 2. So thank you for your time.